I don't know, but someone start the broadcast. So in that moment, the audience can hear us.
Okay.
We will just to say to the audience, we will start in a while. We are just try to solve some technical issues. Um, Maria, can I suggest you that? Sorry, Mary. Can I
Yeah.
suggest you that Maria can share her screen now and share your presentation? Maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Marie, can you share the
Okay, I
presentation?
make her presenter, so she should have the button to share her screen. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
Now
Perfect.
I can see the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So, well, we can start, I think. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. I'm sure that now the majority of you at that point already know me. My name is Alessia Rogai, and I am the Knowledge Management and Learning Coordinator of the project Bridge the Gap. I'm also sure that you know well now Bridging the Gap, but of course we need to consider also those connected today for the first time. So just a short introduction about the project and what we are doing today. And we can finally start this with this second to last session to our cycle. Well, Bridging the Gap is a project funded by the European Union and it's coordinated by FIEP, the International Ibero-American Foundation for Administration and Public Policies, in partnership with three European agencies for development cooperation, the Spanish, the Italian, and the Austrian, and two international NGOs, the European Disability Forum and the International Disability and Development Consortium. Bridging the Gap, as you know, is a targeted is a targeted thematic response to the requirement to make, of course, development and cooperation more accessible and inclusive of persons with disability, which is an obligation for European Union and member states as party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and which can have a significant impact in improving the social inclusion and promotion the rights of persons with disabilities. Bridge the Gap supports the mainstreaming of disability in international cooperation and the efforts of five partner countries, Burkina Faso, Ecuador, Ethiopia, Paraguay, and Sudan, in planning and implementing inclusive public policies and services. Today, we finally arrived to host the 11th session of this cycle of a webinar organized by Bridging the Gap that from the beginning is exploring different topics involving international experts. The webinar, as you know, are conducted in English, French, and Spanish in separated sessions. And you can find all the previous recordings on our website, on our Facebook and Twitter pages, but also on YouTube, on our YouTube channel in separated languages. And you will find the links to our communication channels in a while in the chat box. As I said before, finally we arrived to this extremely important topic that we were attending from the beginning, women and girls with disabilities, that also we find where also the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability dedicates specific attention in its general principles, including equality between men and women as one of, as I said, its general principle, but not only. The Convention, in the Article 6 of the Convention, recognizes that women and girls with disability face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, urging state parties to take all appropriate measures to ensure the full development, advancement, and improvement of women. So, well, in this framework, I'm not going further because I don't want to take time to our panelists today. As I said, in this framework, this session today will try to examine international and national policies and programs aimed to removing barriers to the economic and social empowerment of women and girls with disability. And to support us, to help us to explore this topic today, we have Mary Keogh. Mary is the director of the Disability Inclusive Development Initiative at CBM International. Mary has been involved with CBM for 10 years in a number of capacities, including working as a voluntary board member for CBM International and CBM Ireland, and as an advocacy, technical, and program advisor before being appointed Director of Disability Inclusive Development for CBM International in 2018. Prior to working with CBM, Mary worked with the International Disability Rights Monitor as coordinator of the IDRM European Regional Report. She has also written reports for the UN on inclusive development and most recently contributed to the development of the UN CRPD Committee General Comment on Women and Girls with Disabilities. So I can also go ahead because I know a lot of things about Mary, but of course I think that already like that it's enough to understand that today we have the support of really a wonderful expert for this topic. So I give you the floor, Mary, virtually in a while. Just a couple of technical advice before. As I said, for those who lost the previous session, I invite you to watch the session recordings on our YouTube channel. And also, I remind you that this session is live captioned, so you find the link to follow the live captioning of this session in the chat, already in the chat box. So thank you very much to the audience. Thank you very much to Mary, that today will be also supported by Maria Gonzalez. And I give you both the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alicia. And hello and welcome to everybody. I can say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Generally used to doing webinars that are worldwide audiences. So just to be inclusive, to say hello to everybody in all the different time zones. I'm joined here with my colleague Maria Gonzalez, who might just say a quick hello.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in this webinar today with this such an interesting and in-need topic. So we hope you really enjoy this time as much as we do talking about this.
So we've prepared a small presentation. We don't really want to take up too much time in terms of us kind of speaking all of the time. I want to give enough time for debate and discussions. So we will take you through the presentation and then we will open the floor to discussion afterwards. So just to briefly cover what we're going to discuss today, first of all, we're going to look at who are women and girls with disabilities. How are women and girls with disabilities impacted by discrimination? What are the key issues impacting women and girls with disabilities? How are women and girls with disabilities protected by international law? What steps of development frameworks such as the SDGs taken to ensure the issues that affect women and girls with disabilities are addressed? And then a reflection piece at the end, which is really about, in our own work, what steps can we take to improve policies and programs? We've also pulled together a resource list that you can use and refer to. It's not comprehensive, but it has a number of key literatures that you can use, and it signposts you to other documents also. So I suppose to start off, first of all, when we say who are women with disabilities, Alicia there spoke about when drafting the general comment on women and girls with disability, on women with disabilities for the CRPD committee. One of the questions was, how do you represent such a diverse group? And I'm actually a woman with a disability myself. I speak from my own perspective of coming from Ireland, but that is just my own worldview in that sense. So this is the case for many women with disabilities. So when we discussed originally what this would look like, it was very much around, the recognition that women with disabilities are a very diverse group. We are Indigenous women, we are young girls and we're older women, we are lesbian, bisexual, transgender women and intersex persons. We are also refugee women, migrant, asylum seeker, and internally displaced women. And we're women in detention, for example, hospitals, residential institutions, juvenile or correctional facilities or prisons. And we are women who all come from all walks of life. We are women who live in poverty. We are women who live in wealthier circumstances. We are women from different ethnic, religious, and racial backgrounds. And we are women with different types of disabilities. So that was a paraphrase there of actually what the definition is in terms of the general comment for women with disabilities in the general comment. So I just wanted to put that out there to, I suppose, highlight that we are looking at, you know, a lot of intersecting identities and a lot of multiple layers of identities when we speak about women and girls with disabilities. The slide we just pushed over there quickly is a video which we can't show today, but it's just to say it's there on the PowerPoint slide that Alicia will make available, which is a video basically of women with disabilities and the voices of women with disabilities. So in your own time, you can take some time to look at that. So I might just hand over now briefly to Maria, who's going to take us through multiple discrimination and intersectional discrimination. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Mary. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a little on what is this of intersectionality and multiple discrimination. So for the ones that are not aware at all on this topic, um, women with disabilities, as we really all are intersect by different variables in their lives, right? So I'm a woman, I'm from Latin America, I speak a certain language, I'm from a specific ethnic background. So in some cases, the intersection of these variables can really amplify the vulnerable position of some women. For example, women with disabilities that might also be refugees, or women with disabilities that perhaps are also from specific ethnic background. So nowadays, there's a lot of evidence showing that these intersections can really impact on the life of women with disabilities, because it really increases the position, the vulnerable position of a person, right, that can suffer, and this can lead to perhaps double or triple discrimination. So, for example, in Europe, which is one of the regions that is considered to be to be in a better position, 16% of the population are women with disabilities, and they are considered to be 2 or 3 times more likely to suffer discrimination. So, and there's a quote here. So I think it's important to look at intersectionality of identity. I believe we focus too much on just one. In fact, we are never just one thing. I identify myself as not just a woman. I identify myself as a woman who is Black, from the South, and deaf. So this is an example of a woman that really has different variables intersecting in her life, and as she considers herself being more discriminated for this. So really, the point, I think, there's not really, it doesn't make a lot of sense is that if I read these, you can read them by yourself, but the point of intersectionality is to say that women with disabilities experiences can really be more disadvantaged in specific contexts, because the fact that they are women and because the fact that they have a disability. Okay, so now I'm going to head back to Mary, who's going to talk about how these barriers can really be discriminated into different issues. So heading back to her.
Thank you, Maria. So Maria just spoke about the different layers of intersectional discrimination that women and girls with disabilities can face. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to take you through, I suppose, some of the key areas within economic, social and cultural rights, and then also within civil and political rights, to look at, where this manifests itself and what are the barriers faced. So in terms of, I suppose, one of the key development themes that many of the organisations, and including CBM, works in is the area of access to education. And the World Report on Disability and various other number of reports have found that women and girls with disabilities are recognised as faring less well than boys with disabilities, and also women and girls without disabilities in terms of accessing education and training. So overall, young girls with disabilities and women with disabilities have less access to education. So some of the barriers that are faced then in terms of actually accessing education include lack of access to safe and secure transport to take girls and women with disabilities to school and training, inaccessible classrooms and training spaces, and water and sanitation facilities. So not having access to water and sanitation facilities, for example, can mean many young women with disabilities may drop out of school. And also then, depending in terms of the economic context you're living in, and also the cultural context you're living in, the cost of attending school can also be a barrier for girls with disabilities, particularly for girls living in poverty. And then this can be further compounded by negatively held views about how the value of education girls with disabilities. So in some countries, in some respects, people say there's actually no value to educate girls with disabilities. And this actually intersects sometimes with the view in general that educating girls, is sometimes not necessarily a priority for families. So this is where the intersection of disability and gender issues reach. The other one I wanted to kind of just draw your attention to is economic empowerment, access to employment or livelihood opportunities. So we know from reports like the World Report on Disability that, people with disabilities are more at risk of poverty, and particularly women with disabilities are more at risk of poverty. And it shows that the research that was included in the World Report on Disability highlighted that basically women with disabilities have lower participation rates in labour markets to men with disabilities and to women without disabilities. And also women with disabilities have the added disadvantage of trying to access credit and access microcredit loans, and the challenges that come with that in terms of the views from a gender perspective and also from a disability perspective. So the barriers that are faced, mainly coming from negative attitudes and also misperceptions about the ability of women with disabilities to whether that's to work in a formal work setting or whether that is to run their own business in terms of their own community. So the other one I just wanted to briefly touch under in terms of economic and social and cultural rights was access to health and sexual reproductive rights. So there's very limited data around women with disabilities access to health. And generally when we think of disability, we always think, oh, well, disability and health go hand in hand, particularly if we think of a lot of the medical services that some people with disabilities need, not all people with disabilities. But generally, in terms of all people with disabilities accessing health services, there generally are a number of barriers, and that becomes even further amplified for women with disabilities. So some of the barriers that are faced include the lack of access to healthcare due to the lack of inaccessible equipment, for example, for women who need mammograms, and then also the negative attitude by healthcare staff when it comes to sexual and reproductive healthcare, and also during childbirth. So Human Rights Watch have produced a number of reports that showed where women with disabilities have, really experienced negative attitudes with regards to childbirth and to accessing services in that area. So the other area I wanted to kind of briefly touch on, because unfortunately in a short webinar like this, we're not able to cover everything. So we're covering the economic, social and cultural rights and the civil and political rights, is the aspect that women with disabilities are and face a greater propensity for violence. And this is a particular area around, integrity of women with disabilities, and in terms of autonomy also. So some of the barriers, I mean, there's there's numerous reports from the UN Special Rapporteur which highlight violence as a key issue for women with disabilities. But some of the immediate barriers that women with disabilities face in terms of whether it's to get access to adequate services or whether it's to report crimes, kind of center around, first of all, information not being accessible and not being available. So if a woman with a disability wants to try and find out how do they make a report, what laws have been broken in terms of violating their bodily integrity, the information is not readily accessible and available for women with disabilities. And also their legal recourse, how they actually can take action against that. And then on the flip side of that is, within the judiciary system and within the policing systems, there's a lack of understanding around the specific issues of women with disabilities. And this becomes even more amplified for people, for women with psychosocial disabilities or women with intellectual disabilities, when legal capacity issues interact. So it's a very key challenge in terms of the work we do, all of us in our work around protecting women with disabilities from violence. So in terms of looking at what the protections are, I mean, without going into all of the details, this kind of gives you a kind of a headline as to, I suppose, the evolvement of legal protection for women with disabilities. So the inclusion of women and girls with disabilities in international normative frameworks, it's evolved over a number of decades. It kind of came from, the previous conventions like CEDAW having little or no references to women with disabilities at the time that it was developed. We now have moved into a much more, using the term again, intersectional approach to human rights for women with disabilities. And one of the key drivers of that was the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which basically has a standalone article on women with disabilities, which looks at the different protections, identifies where discrimination happens, and sets out what state parties need to do to ensure that women with disabilities are protected from their human rights perspective. So it also, the CRPD has two elements to it. It has one, a gender mainstreaming element, which basically looks at gender being mainstreamed through all of the articles of the CRPD. And it also, as I said, has a standalone article, which is Article 6. And it also has the general comment, which was developed. Myself and a colleague worked on that and supported other colleagues. And that was, I think, 4 years ago, if I remember, 5 years ago maybe. So that is now in place, which gives state parties, I suppose, the roadmap around the different areas that needs to be addressed with regard to gender equality for women with disabilities. Okay. Yeah, so this last second slide basically is speaking about CEDAW. CEDAW is also now, has started in a number of its jurisprudence that has come out, identifying women with disabilities, and also there is also now a woman with a disability on the CEDAW committee, which is a really wonderful achievement, and hopefully will help keep driving that intersectional view of disability within the international law on women's rights. Okay. So I'm going to hand back over to Maria now, who will broadly speak about the development frameworks.
Perfect. So the gender perspective, it's also including it in some of the international and development frameworks. So for example, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a continuation of the Millennium Development Goals, target specifically in Goal 5, is about gender equality, and it also specifically addresses gender from the perspective of having to be inclusive of all type of women. So as I was previously mentioned about the intersectionality and the multi-discrimination, of course, gender, it's not an exception in the sense that women, it's a very diverse category. So all women are different, and all women have different needs. So that's a very important angle that the SDGs has. So, for example, points such as ending discrimination against all women, eliminate all forms of violence, recognize and value unpaid care work, equalitarian rights and access to economical resources, and growing, enabling technology that is needed, encouraging women to take the lead and to have really the possibility to be in leadership positions, which Mary here is a brilliant example of that. And also access to sexual and reproductive health, which is also fundamental. So all these targets that the SDGs um, touch on are not exclusive of women with disabilities. So that's an important angle, that it's really necessary to start to consider as a key subject. So I'm now going to head back to Mary, which will talk a little bit more about how people can really get involved with this topic.
Thanks, Maria. So I'm just going to take us through the final few slides. And just to give the context for these slides, the set of actions I'm going to start speaking through, and which we can speak to as a group wider when we start opening up for questions, came from a publication that CBM put together before the AWID conference that took place back in 2016, where we supported a delegation of women with disabilities to attend and to have their voices heard within the feminist space that is AWID, because AWID is very much around women's rights and development. So within that, a resource was developed called the 3Ps, which looked at kind of the personal, the political, and the policy. So the 3Ps, I think we have it listed in our resources there, so feel free to use that. It's a useful way to start thinking about, you know, what we can do at different levels when we start to address whether it's in our own work or whether it's within within our work or within our partners that we work with or the alliances that we support. So the first aspect is, I suppose, is the personal. So we always talk about, from women's rights perspective, you talk about the small p and the large p. So, you know, definitely from a personal perspective, women with disabilities, supporting efforts to develop leadership for women with disabilities is really important. So there are a number of organizations who are doing very good work in this. You've got Mobility International in the USA, who basically have a women in leadership program, which brings together women with disabilities from all over the world together to look at how to really build those leadership skills. You've got the work of UN or Women Enabled under the leadership of Stephanie Ortaleva, who really does a lot of work on, you know, how do you start building capacity around human rights for women with disabilities, and how do you start really that influencing work that needs to happen. And all of these are led by women with disabilities who are in leadership positions. And I think, you know, when we talk about it at the personal level, it really is about how we start to actually create those spaces around leadership. When we look then at the next level, which is the political, and that's very much about supporting movement building. So at the AWID conference that we attended back in 2016, the focus of that whole conference was around how do you build diverse intersectional movements where, you know, disability issues don't just sit within the disability movement, that the gender women and the women's rights movement are talking about it, the LGBTQI movement is talking about it, and we're all, you know, basically identifying what it means from a human diversity perspective. So looking at supporting movement building, if there's anybody here who's in a position that's able to look at, you know, donor funding or funding to work, this is really key, because one of the issues that was raised at the AWID meeting when we had the group of women with disabilities with us was that women-led DPOs, disabled people's organisations, actually find it quite challenging to get funding. So whether that's from traditional disability funding sources or whether that's from gender, because sometimes it can fall between the gaps of both, because generally sometimes the funding streams can be very specific to identities. So that was, so looking at how we start kind of developing that kind of political movement and the support that's needed for that. And then the last one is to commit to inclusion in the policy. So, many organizations already have gender mainstreaming policies. So you need to really look at how, how the learning from that can also be applied to a disability perspective, and how if you have a gender program or a gender policy, that it's really thinking about how women and girls with disabilities are included in that. Equally, if you have a disability specific policy around mainstreaming, it's thinking about how women and girls are included in that. So it's very much a two-way street. Disability policies and programs should not ignore gender equality, and equal gender policies and programs should be inclusive of disability rights. And I think that's kind of the key challenge that all of us face in our work about how we actually get the balance of that correct, and what are the tools and the systems that we need to do that. So we might talk a little bit more of that when we come to questions. So we've put together just some resources there for you to access. They're a mixture. Some of them are from CBM, some of them are more external. I think that this is a really kind of growing area. There's a lot of work that needs to be done for us to make sure that we are ensuring that half of the disability population, which are women and girls with disabilities, are included in all of the work that we do. So thank you for listening, and we can maybe open for questions now, Alicia.
Hello. Thank you very much, Mary and Maria, you both, for this really interesting introduction to this topic. I really hope that the audience has a lot of questions, because I have, just for this introduction, I have a lot of questions about the topic, but I want first to give the floor, of course, to our participants. And as usually, you can intervene with our experts today by virtually raising your hand, or also writing your question in the chat box. I really suggest invite you to take the floor, so to raise your hand and directly talk with Mary and Maria, and absolutely don't missing the opportunity that we have time today, and we have time to with Mary and Maria to talk about this topic, and we have the fortune to have their time. So don't be shy, and raise your hand or write your question in the chat box. Before I start giving the floor to the others, as I said, I have some few questions, Mary. So if maybe I can just start me with one of the questions, because as you know, we Bridging the Gap work in several countries in Latin America and also in Africa. And indeed, one now of the, as you know, we work in every country for education in Ecuador, or health in Burkina Faso, or employment in Sudan. Especially in Sudan, we work with a lot with women. But in any case, one of the problems that I hear usually more respect to the others, and also it was one of the main questions raised in the last in the other session, the Spanish and the French one, and even because you was talking about that now it's beginning. Maria said maybe that it's beginning now, the gender equality for persons with disability. So well, indeed, the lack of representation at local level. It's something that at country level, it's really, really, I think, a big issue was raised during our webinars, but also in our work at local level. The lack really of representation of women. So in that case, I'm thinking that if there is this lack of representation of organizations, so there is also all the advocacy work that is missing on that. So maybe that can be considered other barrier to the issue. I don't know what is it something true? And of course, if yes, how we can deal with that locally, especially. Thanks.
Thanks, Alicia. Do you want me to address that? Yes, I can address that first. I just noticed I have a comment from my colleague who actually co-wrote the general comment with me. So she's in the room. So I'm just saying hello to you. So in terms of, I mean, the lack of representation is really one of the, I mean, in general terms for people with disabilities, lack of representation is an issue. And then when you start to think about from a perspective of women and girls with disabilities, you know, like we have to be conscious that the disability movement, like any movement, you know, is sometimes led mainly by men. I'm sorry and apologies to all the men in the room, but I'm just kind of stating the case. So we have the issue then around how you start to really, you really start to unpick this. Because you know it'll happen in some cultures. You know it can be amplified more than others. So the whole piece around representation is starting at the, as you say, at the community level. It really is around the groups that you work with, the self-help groups that are supported to do and to come together and to mobilize together to be able to speak on issues. If you don't have that, you're always going to have this, you know, kind of other perspective, which is that we think, oh, well, we know best, which, you know, people with disabilities in general face that issue, but also women with disabilities face that even more. So I think the issue, you need to start really with asking the questions about who's not in the room, you know, when you're looking at representation. And if women with disabilities aren't in the room, well, then it's not being, it's whatever structure you have, whether it's a program or whether it's an advocacy campaign, it's then it's not representative of half of the disability population, if you want to use a general global term for that. So I think that's something that really needs to be thought of in terms of, you know, doing kind of program design from the early initial stages, who's in the room around what this program needs to address. So if we're addressing a program on vocational rehabilitation or addressing a program on empowerment, economic empowerment, are we thinking around the fact that, you know, women with disabilities might require personal assistance? Are we thinking of the fact that women with disabilities, like other women, could be mothers and need support for childcare? So these are all of the kind of the nitty-gritty detail we need to go to think about being inclusive. Because if we don't, then we are going to miss a gap in that sense. So I think, and it's just to answer, because Sylvia, I think there was another question there, do you have examples of best practice to include women with disabilities in development programs? I mean, there are practices, there are some good examples. I mean, you've got different organizations out there, you know, and I think internally with ourselves in CBM, we still have a long way to go with this. You know, we do have some programs, for example, one around violence with women with disabilities in Cambodia and research that came from that. But there are other organizations as well, like Humanity Inclusion, Sightsavers, who also do a lot of work around inclusion from a gender perspective. So it would be nice to see some resource on that, I think, to help, some kind of a resource through the alliances that we work that really shows the work on gender inclusion and disability. And I think that's something, you know, that all of us as organizations need to consider. But there are some good examples of practices that we can point you to them after the webinar.
Thank you very much, Mary. So I would like to, I can see a raised hand. So I would like to give the floor to talk with our speakers, to Diane Kingston. Okay, I open your mic. Now it's Diane.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So thank you, Maria, and thank you, Mary, very much for a great presentation. And it's fantastic to connect with you. I have two questions. Well, one question and one other thing. The first question is about disaggregated data. And often you see that people want to disaggregate data around disability and age and other factors. But a lot of people put down that they want to disaggregate data around gender rather than sex. So I wondered if you could explain the importance of the difference between the two. And then as a follow-up, I'm really delighted. I'm working now with Sightsavers as their global technical lead on disability inclusion and mainstreaming. And I'm going to be co-hosting and running a gender learning exchange workshop for our West Africa regional office. Is there anything during that 3-day workshop that you think is absolutely essential to cover? If there was one thing that I absolutely had to get across as a message to West African, these are different country offices who have a large portfolio of work, of which working with organisations of people with disabilities is part of, but this is their first exposure, if you like, to gender mainstreaming. Thank you.
Hi, Diane. Nice to hear from you and nice to connect again. I saw your name there, but I wasn't saying it out loud in case of GDPR. I'm really conscious of naming things in public. So great to connect with you again. To answer that question, first of all, in terms of what would be the first thing or what would be a key message, I think it's really about getting the disability organisations or the GPOs or the self-help groups to really internally reflect on what their representative pieces around like gender. Are women with disabilities in that room? Are other, when we talk about gender now, gender is much broader in terms of what we would have thought of many years ago. So this is, that to me is a real starting point. If you have a group in the room, because I think if they're not there, well then the work that all of us will do is not going to be inclusive of women and girls with disabilities, or I think that's just kind of the reality. So I think that's your first point. The second point, in terms of data disaggregation, I have to put my hand up to say I'm not an expert. My colleague who does data disaggregation is not with me on this call. But just in terms of, logically, when we think about how data, we've the discussion at the moment around the Washington group questions, and we have the various sets of different indicators that are coming out through the SDGs. And we did challenges around how we actually even define disability, and how that actually looks. And we know that the Washington group questions have challenges around that, particularly for different identity groups within the disability movement. So I think it's something, from a gender perspective, like we think about it from a sex perspective, it's looking kind of at the biological, counting male, female. We're looking at gender, it's looking much broader in terms of those other structures that create the power dynamics or the power imbalances, and choices. So I think I think we can clearly say that data segregation from within disability perspective is challenging, and then broader than within gender perspective, I think, so it's a good question, Diane, and I'm seriously not trying to avoid the answer, but I'm not also the expert in it, so I'm giving my viewpoint on it. I don't know if Maria had anything you wanted to add to that.
So I'm not an expert on the Washington set of questions neither, but I guess my thought in that is that also collecting data according to gender, not only sex, includes the chance also of people choosing their own option on that, which I think it's a main idea also of collecting disaggregated data, right? So capturing what people really are. So I guess in that sense, it makes sense to really be broader and not only sex focused.
That's great. Thank you both very much.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I don't want, if you, Diane, want to say something more about it. If not, ooh, sorry, you can, I think you can turn on your mic.
Yeah, I would rather pass the floor on to other people. I think I didn't want to put Mary on the spot because I know Mary isn't a data cruncher and that isn't her speciality. But I just wanted to throw out there that that's quite a complex question. And I was really delighted to hear the answer about having the representation in the room, because of the people attending the workshop, it is about half and half, men and women, which is super. But I also want them to go away with a very clear message that as they do the training and cascade it down to their staff and their partner organisations, especially organisations of people with disabilities, that that there's good representation in the room by both men and women and boys and girls too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. So I can see that in the chat box we have another question to referring to your first comments at the beginning, Mary. It's always Sylvia that is asking, commenting like, in my experience, it seems that programs for the inclusion of women with disability must be designed, at least in Africa, especially for women. So how does that conjugate with the concept of inclusion itself?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Sylvia. And I think, you know, I mean, there's sometimes the approaches we take to inclusion can seem counterintuitive to what we actually mean by inclusion. But and I think it's back to the point that Diane made there with regard to who's, you know, in the room and who's representative, back to my original point. So, for example, when we're talking about the inclusion of women with disabilities being designed by women, well, you know, women know best for women in many senses, you know, and I think that I don't think that goes against inclusion. I think that actually is inclusion. I think that's actually recognizing that women are leaders and experts in their own right. And actually, you know, women's programs should be designed by women. Obviously, there should be a fully inclusive approach to that to make sure, you know, but they should be designed by women, because women are, you know, the people who have their experience and their expertise. And from this always kind of comes back to the mainstreaming and the twin track approach discussion that we always get caught up kind of conceptually wise when we think of the broader piece of inclusion and mainstreaming and in its more general sense. And then we go, well, then why do we also need to do targeted pieces? Why do we need to do targeted programs? Why can't everybody fit within the same umbrella of inclusion? Sometimes there are needs for those targeted direct supports. So, you know, and I think we have to understand that as part of inclusion, you know, that it's okay to do that. I mean, where it's not okay is when it's, you know, separating people out or specializing or further stigmatizing. But if it's about empowerment and if it's about giving the space for women with disabilities to come together in their own space to speak about their issues when they've never had that before, to be able to look at how to, you know, design and input into programs that meet their needs, I think that that's actually justifiable. But then that's just my view. But I think, you know, we need to think of the approaches we take to inclusion. Sometimes we think from an inclusive perspective, we need to have, you know, everybody in the room, and we do. But there are also some times when we need to have smaller groups with the lived experience being able to actually give their experience to lead developments, whether it's in programs or in policies, because I think that's pretty critical to do.
Thank you very much, Mary. I absolutely agree with you. Indeed, I was thinking when you were thinking about it now, about especially mainstreaming. You said also during the presentation talking about ensuring mainstreaming, and I'm 2 years that indeed I'm working for Bridging the Gap, a little bit more than 2 years, and I'm working especially on mainstreaming because Bridging the Gap is a project funded to support especially the mainstreaming, the disability mainstreaming in all in its partner projects, program, etc. Especially, we support the Commission, the DG DEFCO, on that. So we talk a lot about mainstreaming, and in the last 2 years, a lot of time I heard, because I work on that, that we have to refer, for example, about the work that has been done on the gender mainstreaming, and take inspiration from some practices on how the gender mainstreaming works. So, and I was just maybe it's I don't know if it's a good question, but indeed, it's the gender mainstreaming, how the gender mainstreaming considered women and girls with disabilities in its work, especially thinking that if we want to say that they started years ago working on mainstreaming regarding gender. I don't know if I was clear, but you have some comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I can give some general comments. I think there's a number of things. I think from the perspective of the gender mainstreaming or the women, you would have had this theoretical debate between, women in development or mainstreaming gender. That was a debate that went on for decades in regard to when CEDAW came about, and the Beijing platform. Do you push the identity, or do you push the wider structural issues around equality? And I think that still remains with us today. And I think actually even gender equality itself is going through a significant change of what do we actually mean by gender now, because gender has become quite fluid in terms of how we understand it, and rightly so. We've challenges that come from different groups, embracing what gender equality set out to do. So I think one of the aspects is, though, the gender equality in its initial stages, or if you look at the movements that came with it, were not necessarily always conscious or even inclusive of women with disabilities, or people with disabilities in general, because you had the intersection of, women generally being the people who are carers in society as well. So you had this intersection between women being the primary carers in society, and then you've got people with disabilities. And you had this particular kind of, I don't use the term flashpoint, but people with disabilities were seen sometimes in the view of, the care perspective, or the perspective of possibly, creating a situation where women are, if you're a mother of a person with a disability, or, so there was all of those challenges were there. I think we're moving past that now. I think the intersectionality that Maria spoke about earlier on is really beginning to really start to identify that, look, we're not just one individual, we're not just one identity with it makes us up. We actually have to look at what are the systemic structures that we need to change in society, what are the power balances that we need to change. I think that's beginning to overall change from a gender perspective. From gender mainstreaming, I think we've lessons we can take from gender mainstreaming. People, generally can be exhausted by the term mainstreaming, because, there's different views on whether it's worked or not. And that is a big debate, and, there's different sides to that. But there are particular things you can take from it. You can take the, development of technical experts on gender inclusion, the systems to measure and hold organizations to account about, are they being inclusive? The accountability piece around, is your board or your board of trustees representative of women? So I think that's, we need to really draw from that. That's the learning we can draw from gender mainstreaming from a disability perspective, and actually really look at those tools that we use to advance it. But we're living in a world at the moment where gender equality is under, massive challenges. So I think it's there's no kind of necessarily easy answer to that. But I think, yes, we can learn from gender mainstreaming, but I think we also need to challenge the gender equality movement around being more inclusive from a disability perspective.
Yeah,
I don't
exactly.
know if that answers that. I'm
exactly,
not sure if that
exactly. I agree with you. I agree with you absolutely. No. Yes, it will be also useful for my work on that. As I said, working especially on mainstreaming, sometimes we word just throw these words, but what they means, what they mean. So thank you very much. I can see another hand. So I give you the floor, Wazemi Ali. Thank you.
Hello,
Hello.
Hello.
thank you, Maria and Mary, for your presentation and for all the information we got it from you. It's very clear and very benefit for us. But please correct me if I'm wrong. I think we should focus first step on the persons with disability. After that, we can come back to the small details like on gender, on the women and girls with disability. So my thought, first we should focus on the person with disability in general because like in our countries and they are discrimination from everything. They don't look to the gender or anything else. Only they are person with disability, so they discriminate all of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Wasim. I might just answer that, just I suppose, just to come back to, and I absolutely take your point on board regarding, in different countries, there's different entry points to talk about inclusion, and sometimes it can be easier to do that from a disability inclusive perspective than to do it from a gender perspective. So,
Yes.
but I think the thing we need to remember is, and I think it's the first slide that we put up, is, who are we as women with disabilities, but who are we as people with disabilities? And people with
Yeah.
disabilities, are women and men and girls and boys with disabilities. So I think in our work of putting disability, if you want to do it through a disability lens, you just need to make sure that the gender lens is included in that. It might not be it might not be the first thing you say to somebody, but it might come after. So, it might come once you've had your initial discussions around inclusion. You say, look, are you thinking about disability inclusion? How are you approaching that? And then you can follow it up to say, well, how is it for women with disabilities? What particular approaches are you taking? Or what are you taking for young girls with disabilities or young boys with disabilities? So I think, it's very much about the context you work in. I think it's very easy
Mm.
to make very general statements around gender equality and disability equality, but the reality is when it comes to the country you're in, it's very different.
Mm.
And each country is different in that sense.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, so I think your audience best. But I think if we were to leave out the gender aspect, or if we leave out women and girls with disabilities, or if we leave out including approaches to the empowerment of women and girls with disabilities, I think then you will miss something and need to come back to it later anyhow. So it's good if you can, integrate it in the beginning. But yeah, I absolutely take your point on board. I understand all of this.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very much. I don't see other hands raised. I really invite the audience to take the opportunity that we have this kind of experts today talking about this important topic. So I repeat, don't be shy and raise your hands. If not, I'm going ahead because, as I said, I have a lot of questions. I'm really trying to take the opportunity to have you for this 1 hour and a half. So if there are, for the moment, there aren't other questions from the audience, I have another question for you, both for Mary and Maria. We started also, of course, related to bridging the gap. Um, we started we you talk at the beginning about the different background from, of course, women are coming, and there is one that in the last year is really raising interest, but of course in a negative way because it's becoming really an emergency. I think all around the world it's about the placement, the migrations, persons with the issue about migrants all around the world. That, of course, even more for women and girls with disability, the risk, I think, for, of course, not just the writing about rights or but in terms of violence and really a lot of respect to men in the same situation, of course. So my question in terms of in the framework of the international context, like what I would say, in the international context, for example, UN has a plan specific for when talk about migration to address or more attention to this issue, or we are so far in terms of migrants or refugees with disability that the topic about specific to women and girls with disability has not been touched until now.
Thanks, Alicia. Big question. I'll see how much I can address, and I know there's probably other colleagues in the room that can support with this as well. You know, when we talk about kind of the migration and the the displacement that's happened and we're seeing on a daily basis, when you were asking that question, actually the woman that popped into my head is Eugene, if I'm saying her name now, Eugene Mustafa, who came from Syria to Germany and told the story of her travel from, with her family across all of the various different countries. And it was interesting, actually, and I really recommend people to read her book because she speaks from a lived experience about actually the challenges of coming from, she traveled by boat and they had to bring her wheelchair in the boat. And there was a discussion at one stage around, actually, I think we might need to leave this behind because there isn't enough room with the rest of the family. And then when she arrived to Greece, and it was the traveling upwards, the accessibility of trains. And now she lives in Germany, her family are with her in Germany, and she's accessing education, and she's, I just think, wow, her story, when you hear it and when you read it, is incredibly powerful to actually give you a real insight into the story of somebody who's lived this, because we generally speak from a very theoretical perspective. So when you talk about the UN and their plans around migration, you talk about the international protection is there for people with disabilities. It is there for women and girls with disabilities, but the agencies that are working and supporting necessarily mightn't have the technical skills and the capacity to be able to deliver on it. And what you'll find sometimes is that women and girls with disabilities will be part of, whether it's a camp or part of a settlement structure, possibly just by default, without having any of the issues or needs kind of addressed. So I think it's a big, I mean, it will become even a bigger challenge when we look at how climate change is impacting in terms of the countries that people are also leaving and coming from. So it's something that we really need to address into the future. I mean, organisations like EDF are doing work with regard to refugees and migrants in terms of Greece, because it became a big issue in Greece, and for the national organisation there. So we have a collective knowledge on this. We just need to start figuring out how to elevate it to a level that we can share it, so that it doesn't become so overly technical, but it becomes part of an already complex issue that many countries are dealing with. So yeah, no particular silver bullet, to use a term, as we say in Ireland, to answer that question. But I think it really is about the getting organisations to actually share their practices about how they've done it to inspire others to do it, and listening to voices of people who've been through the journey and been through the trauma of it, I think is really important.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you. I know that it's a really big topic, this one, really urgent at that moment, like unfortunately many others. So I really invite also the audience, not just asking questions at that point, but even to share your experience and respect to the thematic we touched in this last 1 hour. Also about this topic connecting migration with persons with disability, especially respect to the risk of women and girls with disability. I can see from our audience today, we have participants from several countries in Africa, Asia, and also in Europe. So I really invite you to share with us your experience. Um, respect that thematic, but also with about the other topics we talk today. For example, some best practices on how include women and girls with disability in development projects, development programs at local level. If you have experience on that, so don't be shy and share it with us. Thank you. I don't know, Mary, if you have any other maybe comment on that or.
I have nothing to add beyond what I just said. Yeah, no. Sorry, Alicia.
Sorry, say it again.
No,
I
I'm
didn't
saying
say
sorry
it.
from my side. I have nothing else to add to it except, I would really recommend people read that book to see the real life experience. But I mean, I welcome other people in the room because we have a lot of different experts in the room. So if there's others that have any particular viewpoints on this, it would be good to hear them.
Okay, well, so thank you very much, Mary. Thank you very much, Maria. I don't know if you, Maria, want to add anything more, or we can arrive at the end of this session.
I think not. I don't have any specific comments. All the discussions were really interesting. I think some topics, there's more work and information in some of the topics that were discussed than other ones. For example, migration. But not really, to be honest. Thank you very much for your questions as well, because all the questions were really interesting, and then it's interesting how to see the perspective, the different perspectives, really.
Okay,
Well,
thank you very much, you
thank you,
both.
Alicia, for having
Yes.
us.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting, and thank you also to Maria to
Thank you,
join this
Alicia.
session today. So I would like also to thank you, as usual, our audience, our participants. Thank you also for the question. I really hope that you found this session useful. We will provide. As I said at the beginning, it was the second to last session of this cycle that started now 1 year ago. We will host the last session of this cycle the last week of November. uh, I will we will communicate you really soon the dates, because we have already the speakers for the last session. So the speaker for the Spanish one will be Stefan Trommel, that you have as a speaker for the English session about employment, and for the French and the English will be Alex Scott. So really don't miss also this last two important this last session. I will come back with more information, details about this the last session and the registration link really soon. Well, thank you very much again to everybody. Thank you, Mary and Maria. And so we will talk soon again about this topic. I'm pretty sure. Even because we will, as Bridging the Gap, we will have our annual event this year in Rome, the 14th of November, and the topic will be exactly about will be women and girls with disabilities. So another occasion, another opportunity to learn more about that and how to support really practically at global level, but especially at country level, women and girls with disabilities. So, well, thank you very much to everybody again, and see you virtually as usual. See you end of November for the last session of
Take
the
care.
Bridging the Gap.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a lovely
Bye.
day. Bye.
Thank you. See you. Bye bye.